When you hear the word Viking, what comes to mind? Probably horned helmets, even though they never wore them. Epic long ships slicing through icy waves, and fierce, bearded warriors charging into battle with axes and shields. That's the image we get from movies and TV shows. Heroic, adventurous, almost romanticized. But behind this popular image lies a much darker, more brutal reality that history often forgets to tell. This isn't a story of glorious battles between armies. This is the story of what happened when the Viking Age of expansion met the quiet, sacred world of Christian Europe. The Vikings didn't just sail to fight kings and their soldiers. Their raids were often opportunistic, targeting places that were wealthy but poorly defended, and the wealthiest, most defenseless targets of all were the monasteries. These were centers of learning, art, and faith. They held priceless treasures, gold chalices, silver crosses, and beautifully illuminated manuscripts that took years to create. For the Vikings, these holy sites were simply treasure chests waiting to be broken open. The first recorded major Viking raid in 793 on the monastery of Lindisfarne in England sent a shockwave across the Christian world. It was a brutal sacrilege, an attack on God himself in the eyes of the people at the time. But the Vikings took more than just gold and silver. They took people. And inside these monasteries lived communities of women, nuns who had dedicated their lives to prayer, study, and service. They had chosen a life of peace and seclusion, away from the violence of the outside world. They believed the walls of their convents would protect them. They were wrong. For the raiders, these women were just another form of plunder. The historical accounts from that time are chilling. They speak of unspeakable violence, of sacred vows being shattered, and of women being dragged from their sanctuaries in chains. Imagine the terror. One moment, your world is filled with a quiet rhythm of prayer and contemplation. The next, the doors are smashed open, and your sacred space is overrun by warriors who see you not as a person, but as property. These women were captured and sold into slavery across the Viking world. They were taken far from their homes, their faith, and everything they had ever known, forced into a life of servitude. This was the fate of countless women from raided monasteries in England, Ireland, and France. Their stories are a stark and tragic counterpoint to the heroic sagas of Viking warriors. One of the most powerful, though debated stories, comes from Coldingham Priory in Scotland. Legend says that when the nuns heard that a Danish raiding party was approaching, they knew what fate awaited them. Led by their abbess, Eva the Younger, they made a desperate choice. To make themselves undesirable to the raiders, they chose to disfigure themselves, cutting off their own noses and upper lips. When the Vikings broke in, they were so repulsed and enraged by what the women had done that they locked them inside the priory and burned it to the ground. The nuns chose a horrific death over a life of violation and slavery. This story, whether entirely factual or a legend born from the horrors of the time, highlights the extreme measures women were driven to. It reveals the grim reality that lay beneath the surface of the Viking Age. It wasn't just about adventure and exploration. For many, it was an age of terror, loss, and unimaginable suffering. The romantic image of the Viking warrior fades when you look into the eyes of those they victimized. Their stories, the stories of these forgotten women, are a crucial, sobering part of history that deserves to be remembered. So next time you see a portrayal of Vikings, remember the silence of the monasteries and the voices that were stolen. Thank you for watching. If you found this glimpse into the darker side of history interesting, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that you won't find in the usual textbooks. See you next time. When you hear the word Viking, what comes to mind? Horned helmets, giant axes, and fleets of longships crashing onto unsuspecting shores. Right? For centuries, that's been the popular image. Savage, bloodthirsty raiders from the frozen north. And while they were definitely fierce warriors, that's only a fraction of the story. The truth about the Vikings is far more complex, and frankly, far more interesting. They weren't just destroyers. They were builders, traders, explorers, and pioneers who left their mark on the entire world. Let's start by busting that biggest myth right away. The horned helmets. Sorry to disappoint, but there's zero historical or archaeological evidence that Vikings ever wore them in battle. That whole idea was cooked up for an opera in the 19th century and just sort of stuck. In reality, A Viking warrior would likely wear a simple helmet made of iron or leather, something practical that wouldn't get caught on a branch or an opponent's weapon. Their real power wasn't in their headgear, but in their mindset, a mindset forged in the harsh, unforgiving landscapes of Scandinavia. Life in 8th century Scandinavia was tough. The land was rocky, the growing seasons were short, and survival was a daily struggle. This environment bred a culture that valued strength, self-reliance, and courage above all else. For a Viking, strength wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about surviving the winter, providing for your family, and enduring hardship without complaint. It was a practical necessity. This is why their sagas and poems are filled with tales of legendary heroes who faced down giants, sea monsters, and impossible odds. These weren't just stories. They were instruction manuals for how to live and die with honor. This harsh reality also shaped their approach to the world. Why raid? Well, for one, it was profitable. Monasteries and towns in England and France were wealthy and poorly defended, easy targets for fast-moving raiders who could strike from the sea and disappear before a response could be organized. But it wasn't just about mindless plunder. Raiding was a way for a young chieftain to gain wealth, followers, and prestige. It was a high-risk, high-reward venture that could elevate a man's status overnight. In their world, fear wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was a tool, a weapon. If your enemies feared the sight of your longship's dragon-headed prow, they were less likely to fight back. Power came from projecting an image of unstoppable force. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The same ships that carried them on raids also carried them on voyages of trade and exploration. Vikings were master shipbuilders and navigators. Their iconic longships were technological marvels, fast, flexible, and capable of navigating both open oceans and shallow rivers. This gave them unparalleled mobility. They didn't just sail west to England. They sailed east, down the great rivers of Russia, establishing trade routes that stretched all the way to Constantinople in the Middle East. They traded furs, amber, and walrus, ivory for silver, silks, and spices. In cities like Baghdad, they were known not as terrifying raiders, but as the Rus, sophisticated merchants bringing exotic goods from the north. And they didn't just visit, they settled. Vikings established colonies in Iceland, a land of fire and ice that no one else had dared to inhabit. From there, the legendary Eric the Red led an expedition to Greenland, creating a Norse settlement that lasted for nearly 500 years. And his son, Leif Erikson, went even further, landing in North America almost 500 years before Columbus. A place they weren't just conquering. They were exploring the boundaries of the known world, driven by a relentless curiosity and a desire for new lands and opportunities. They founded cities that still exist today, like Dublin and Ireland, and their influence can be seen in the languages, laws, and even the DNA of people across Europe. So, the next time you think of the Vikings, picture more than the axe-wielding warrior. Picture the skilled craftsman carving an intricate design into a ship's prow. Picture the merchant haggling in a bustling Byzantine market. Picture the farmer clearing land in the wilds of Iceland, and the navigator staring at the stars, guiding his ship toward an unknown shore. They were a people of profound contradictions, brutal raiders and savvy traders, pagan worshippers and eventual converts, destroyers and founders of nations. They were a force of nature that erupted out of Scandinavia and permanently reshaped the world. Their story isn't just one of blood and battle. It's a timeless saga of human ambition. Have you ever wondered why Vikings and other raiders always seem to target monasteries? It's a common scene in movies and TV shows. Fearsome warriors storming a peaceful abbey. But why there? Why not attack a heavily fortified castle instead? The answer is simpler and more brutal than you might think. It all comes down to a classic risk versus reward calculation. Let's start by looking at what a monastery was, and more importantly, what it wasn't. A monastery was a center of prayer, learning, and quiet contemplation. The monks who lived there dedicated their lives to religious devotion. They were scholars, scribes, and farmers, not soldiers. They had no standing army, no trained guards, and certainly no knights in shining armor ready to defend them. While some larger monasteries might have had a wall, it was usually more for marking boundaries and keeping out stray animals than for repelling a determined armed force. These walls were nothing compared to the formidable stone fortifications of a castle, which were built specifically for war. A castle had high curtain walls, gatehouses, towers, and a garrison of professional soldiers whose entire job was to fight. Attacking a castle was a serious, costly, and often deadly undertaking for any raiding party. Now, let's consider the reward part of the equation. What was inside a castle? Sure, the lord might have some personal wealth, but much of the value was in the land, the people, and the strategic control it offered. These weren't things a Viking raider could easily carry back onto their longship. A successful raid on a castle might yield some loot, but the effort and risk involved were immense. You could lay siege for months, lose dozens of men, and still come away with very little portable treasure. Contrast that with a monastery. Despite their lack of defenses, monasteries were astonishingly wealthy. For centuries, nobles and common folk alike had donated riches to the church to secure their place in the afterlife. This meant monasteries were filled with treasures that were both incredibly valuable and, crucially, portable. We're talking about solid gold crosses encrusted with jewels, ornate silver chalices and plates used for communion, and beautifully decorated reliquaries holding the bones of saints, often covered in gold leaf. Even the books were treasures. A single illuminated manuscript, painstakingly copied and illustrated by hand on expensive vellum, could be worth a fortune, more than a farm or a small estate. So, from a raider's perspective, the choice was obvious. On one hand, you have the castle, high risk, difficult to capture, and with limited, portable loot. On the other hand, you have the monastery, virtually zero risk, undefended by soldiers, and packed with gold, silver, and other easy-to-carry riches. The monks could offer little resistance. It was the medieval equivalent of robbing a bank versus trying to break into a military fortress. The raiders weren't just being cruel. They were being ruthlessly practical. They followed the path of least resistance to the greatest reward. This is why so many historical accounts, from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to Irish annals, are filled with tragic stories of monasteries being sacked. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793 is the most famous example, sending a shockwave across Christian Europe. It wasn't the first, and it certainly wasn't the last. For a few hundred years, these peaceful centers of faith and learning became the primary, and tragically easy, targets for anyone looking to get rich quick. It was a dark and violent chapter, all driven by the simple, cold love. Have you ever wondered what life was really like inside a convent? For centuries, Christian nuns have chosen a path that most of us can barely imagine. It's a life of profound discipline, deep faith, and a complete departure from the world we know. Let's pull back the curtain and explore the extraordinary lives these women led. First, imagine taking a vow of silence, not just for an hour or a day, but for years, or even a lifetime. For many nuns, silence wasn't a punishment. It was a pathway to God. By quieting the outside world, they believed they could hear the voice of the divine more clearly. Communication would happen through simple hand gestures or written notes, but the primary focus was on internal reflection and prayer. This wasn't about isolation. It was about a different kind of connection, one that transcended spoken words. Then there was the vow of obedience. In our modern world, we value independence and making our own choices. But for a nun, surrendering her will to a higher authority both to God and to her mother superior was a core tenet of her faith. Every part of her day, from when she woke to what she ate to the work she performed, was dictated by the rules of her order. This structured life wasn't meant to be restrictive, but to free the soul from the burden of personal desire and ego, allowing her to focus entirely on her spiritual purpose. Living apart from society was another huge commitment. Convents and abbeys were often built like fortresses, with high walls separating the sisters from the outside world. This separation, known as enclosure, wasn't about hiding. It was about creating a sacred space, a sanctuary where the community could dedicate itself to prayer without distraction. They left behind their families, their friends, and everything they once knew. It was a radical choice, a complete break from their former lives, all in the service of their spiritual calling. Perhaps one of the most difficult vows for us to understand today is the rejection of personal wealth. Nuns took a vow of poverty, meaning they owned nothing. The clothes on their back, the simple bed they slept in, the food they ate, all belonged to the community. This wasn't just about living simply. It was a profound statement against the materialism of the world. By renouncing possessions, they believed they could avoid the temptations of greed and envy, and instead cultivate a richness of the spirit. Any work they did, whether it was farming, scribing manuscripts, or caring for the sick, benefited the entire community, not the individual. And finally, the vow of chastity, the promise to remain unmarried and abstain from romantic relationships. This is often seen as the ultimate sacrifice, but for these women, it was a way to dedicate their love and devotion entirely to God. They viewed themselves as brides of Christ, and this spiritual union was the most important relationship in their lives. It was a choice that required immense strength and conviction, freeing them from earthly attachments to pursue a higher, celestial love. The life of a nun was not easy. It was a path of sacrifice, discipline, and unwavering faith. They gave up worldly pleasures for spiritual fulfillment, personal freedom for communal harmony, and individual identity for a life devoted to God. While it might seem like a stark and difficult existence, for these women, it was a life of purpose, peace, and profound meaning. It's a powerful reminder that there are many different ways to imagine stepping back in time to the Viking Age, a period of fierce raids and exploration. We often picture Vikings storming coastal villages, swords drawn, a terrifying sight for anyone in their path. But what happened when these raiders encountered a world completely alien to their own serene, sacred space of a Christian nunnery? Let's explore the chilling and often overlooked story of these two worlds colliding. The early medieval period saw the rise of monasticism across Europe. Nunneries weren't just places of prayer. They were centers of learning, art, and community for women. They were sanctuaries, places where women dedicated their lives to God, living in peaceful seclusion. To the outside world, these were holy grounds, protected by faith and respected by local populations. But to the Vikings, who held different beliefs and saw the world through a different lens, these religious houses presented a very different picture. To a Viking raider, a nunnery was a soft target. It was often located near the coast for easy access, undefended by stone walls or professional soldiers, and rumored to be filled with treasures. Not treasures of gold coins necessarily, but precious religious artifacts, silver chalices, gilded manuscripts, and richly embroidered clothes. These items, priceless to the Christian faith, were simply valuable commodities to be plundered and sold or melted down. The Vikings were pragmatic. They sought wealth and resources, and nunneries appeared to be an easy source. So, the scene is set. A longship silently approaches the shore. The Vikings disembark, weapons in hand, and advance on the quiet convent. Inside, the nuns are going about their daily routines of prayer, study, and work. Then, the doors splinter open. Charles, Edo. But what happens next is what makes this story so profoundly tragic. Unlike soldiers or armed villagers, the nuns offered no physical resistance. Their vows and way of life were centered on peace and nonviolence. Their strength was spiritual, not martial. They couldn't fight back in the way a warrior would. Instead, they faced the invaders with prayers and hymns, perhaps hoping for divine intervention or a show of mercy. But their faith was no shield against steel. For the nuns, the horror was multi-layered. First, there was the sacrilege. They were forced to watch as their sacred home was altars were overturned, holy books were torn apart, and relics they had revered their entire lives were casually smashed or stolen. This wasn't just theft, it was the violent destruction of their entire world, an attack on their very souls and the God they served. The psychological trauma of witnessing this would have been immense. Then came the human cost. While sagas and chronicles often focus on the plunder, they sometimes omit the grim fate of the people. The nuns were torn from the only home they knew. They were separated from their sisters, the women with whom they had shared a life of devotion and companionship. This tight-knit community, their family, was shattered in an instant. The fate of the captured women was bleak. They were now considered part of the loot, human commodities. They could be sold in the bustling slave markets of Dublin or Hidibi, or taken back to Scandinavia. Their lives of scholarly pursuit and spiritual contemplation were violently replaced by a future of servitude and uncertainty. Thousands of miles from home, in a land with a strange language and alien gods, The very identity they had built as devout women was stripped away, leaving them vulnerable and alone. This isn't a story of heroes and villains in the traditional sense. It's a stark reminder of what happens when vastly different cultures clash. For the Vikings, it was business. For the Nuns, it was the end of the world. It's a somber chapter in history, one that highlights the profound human tragedy that often lies beneath the grand tale. Have you ever thought about what happens when the protectors need protecting? We often picture nuns as serene figures, living lives of quiet contemplation and service, safely within the walls of their convents. But history holds a darker, often untold story. A story where these women of faith were not safe at all. Today, we are going to pull back the curtain on a forgotten chapter. The story of nuns taken as captives. Imagine a sudden, violent raid. The peace of the convent is shattered. For these women, being taken captive was more than just physical imprisonment. It was a systematic stripping away of everything they were. First came the loss of identity. A nun's habit, her veil, her religious name, these weren't just clothes or a title. They were powerful symbols of her devotion, her community, and her entire life's purpose. Captors would often forcibly remove these symbols. The habit was replaced with foreign garments, and her religious name was erased, replaced by a new one given by her captor. This wasn't just a change of clothes. It was an attempt to erase her very soul, to sever the connection to her faith and the life she had chosen. She was no longer Sister Agnes or Sister Maria. She was just another captive, anonymous and lost. Next came the loss of protection. Convents and monasteries were historically seen as sanctuaries, sacred spaces under the protection of both the church and local rulers. They were meant to be untouchable, but when these walls were breached, the divine and earthly protection vanished. The nuns were thrust into a brutal world without allies, without the familiar structure of their religious order, and far from the Christian lands they called home. They were utterly vulnerable, subject to the whims of their captors, with no one to appeal to and no one to come to their rescue. The very institution that was supposed to shield them had failed. And finally, there was the loss of voice. In their communities, particularly in roles of leadership like an abbas, these women held positions of authority and influence. Their voices mattered. They managed large estates, educated others, and were respected leaders. As captives, they were silenced. They were often transported to foreign lands where they didn't speak the language, couldn't communicate, and had no social standing. Their opinions, their knowledge, their very right to speak were taken from them. They became invisible. Their stories unheard, their pleas unanswered. These women were effectively erased from the historical record. Removed from Christian lands, they disappeared into the vastness of foreign empires and distant worlds. For their communities back home, they were simply gone. Sometimes prayers were said, and sometimes ransom was attempted, but more often than not, they were lost forever. They became footnotes in history, if they were mentioned at all. Their individual struggles, their resilience, and their faith in the face of unimaginable hardship were largely forgotten. Why is it important to remember these stories? Because they challenge our understanding of history and faith. They remind us that the lives of women, especially religious women, were far more complex and perilous than we often imagine. They were not just passive figures in a chapel. They were individuals who faced the same brutal realities as anyone else in a turbulent world. By remembering them, we give them back their voice. We acknowledge their suffering, and we honor their incredible and often tragic resilience. Their stories are a testament to the strength of the human spirit, even when stripped of everything. Thank you for joining me to uncover this piece of hidden history. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the past. See you next time.